Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors talk about how they write books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. You can find us on YouTube. Just look for The Writer's Dream, or for my name, Linda Maria Frank. You can also find us on Facebook. Look for The Writer's Dream. If you would like to be on the show or ask a question about the show, please message me through the Facebook page. Today we have two esteemed authors with us who have been on The Writer's Dream a few times. One as host, that's Jack Bolello, who's the author of Bonds of War, American Patrol, Heart of a Lion, and I Still Love Joni James. And we have Sal LaGumina with us, who has been with us a few times, and his latest book is The Office of Strategic Services and Italian Americans, and he's written several books about Italian Americans, and all of them interesting and requiring research. And research is something all authors do. We all have to research, even if you just have to find out where the United States is as far as what hemisphere it's in. Some of us don't know that. But there are degrees of research, and I'm going to start with Sal because Sal writes nonfiction. Jack and I write, well, you write sort of, Jack writes sort of.
Historical fiction.
Yeah, and I write fiction. So Sal, how do you proceed to do your research? You start with an idea, and how do you do the research to give the books the gravitas that they have?
Well, I think I'd like to start with something I know something about, something that comes from my background, and so at least I have some beginnings. Mm-hmm. And then the normal research tools of that you find in libraries, in newspapers, etc. Much of what I write about is not ancient history, so I have the advantage of being able to utilize things like the New York Times Index, as well as the primary and secondary works that are out there. I've also been able to use quite well the interviews, personal interviews, and I find that extremely helpful. So I use the assortment of things. With the computer, we have the benefit of bringing before us a lot of material that would otherwise be either inaccessible or time-consuming. So I use whatever is at my disposal. In the work that I've done, various works, I use a lot of newspapers, magazines, journals, etc. Sometimes I have to resort to doctoral dissertations, unpublished papers that are housed in various archives. The New York Public Library, I've spent countless hours in places at that library, various other college libraries. So I go wherever the path seems to lead me. But yes, it is extensive research. And I'll just end off that comment by making an observation that a colleague of mine once made about research and writing. We over-research. We have much more than we can actually put into a book. And so that's what I tend to do.
Well, I think that's being all of us, all three of us, teachers, we tend to do that. We tend to make sure that we have enough to cover that lesson and maybe even more than that. And so I understand that completely. So what's the most interesting place you've ever visited to do your research? Did you have to go to Italy?
I did not have to go to Italy for research, but it helped to give me a more explicit picture of what I was writing about. Most of what I write about are Italian Americans. Mm-hmm. And so I was acquainted with that growing up in that environment, and so I understood that. As opposed to, I don't pass myself off as an Italian scholar. I'm an Italian American. And therefore, it's part of American history that I'm writing about. That's
a good point.
Yes. A lot of people don't they hear me writing about Italian Americans and they automatically think I'm writing about Italy. That's not my field or my specialty. I'm writing about an aspect of American history. It's as legitimate as writing about African Americans, Indian Americans, etc. And so I'm really filling in American history in that regard. Now the question you asked, what most interesting? Well, there's so many. I'll just mention my recent book. The people that, some of the people I wrote about in the Office of Strategic Services in Italian Americans, I was fortunate enough to meet. Indeed, one of them was in my class. I taught graduate courses at Wesleyan University, and he acquainted me with material that I was unfamiliar with. You know, at best I knew just hazy ideas about the Office of Strategic Services, but he provided me not only with his personal testimony, but with actual documents. And so that was very useful, very important.
Well, I often think of doing research for anything. It's like going through a maze. When I first started using the computer for research, I found that you would go to one site and that would take you to two other sites, and those sites would take you somewhere else. And it was like, it began to be a geometric progression of places you could go to. And eventually you find out that many of them duplicate what's there. But I think that's what research is like. It's, you went to this person, you expected to get one thing, and you got several other things. Probably you go to some people and you get nothing. So it's an interesting journey, interesting kind of experience that authors go through when they do research. And the reason why I thought of doing this topic is many people ask me about, you know, how did you write that book? Well, I sat down with a pad, and that's usually what I say. I use my smart Alex self. But what they really mean is, where do you get, first of all, they ask, where does the idea come from? And I had one author quote on the show, thin air.
Thin air.
And then, but you're right, it's something from your personal experience. I know Jack's book in particular, I Still Love Joni's James. Talk about that, Jack.
Yeah, well, just as a footnote to what you just said, I believe it was Leonard Cohen, who just died not that long ago. He was asked, where do you get your ideas? He says, if I knew where I get my ideas, I would visit that place more often. Because you never know what the moment will hit you. And for example, I knew that the book on Joni James was inside of me, because it's really, even though it's a novel, it's so much of fiction is based on reality and truth and experience. So I wanted to tell this story of a young boy growing up in Brooklyn in the 1950s. As luck would have it, coincidentally, I was a young boy growing up in Brooklyn in the 1950s. So I had a plethora of experiences with family and friends and the Brooklyn Dodgers and Coney Island, all of the things that made Brooklyn such a special place. And even though it is a work of fiction, there is such a, you know, like truth is stranger than fiction, and that is something that I relied on. So you never know where you're going to get your ideas, but for me, I have to have a passion for what I'm writing about. I just can't write something unless I am committed to it in a passionate way. In each of the 4 books that I've written, I have had a passion for, even though they're different genres. They're completely different. There's nothing there that's similar, but that's the only way I feel I can write successfully, if I have that passion for it.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I think Jack has put it very well, the passion for what you're dealing with. Because unless you have a real strong interest in it, it's going to be a drag, and you're not really going to, so you have to really believe in what you're doing.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting when you told me that you had to go back to Brooklyn and research all the street names.
Absolutely. Sure, I had to make sure my memory coincided with reality. So I did go back to my old neighborhood in East New York, Brooklyn, and just made sure that all of the street names were accurate. And you know, there are things that, like as you said, Lynn, you never know where you're going to get an idea. A number of years ago, I was reading about a ship, a sunken treasure ship, a Spanish galleon that was recovered from the 16th, 17th century, and they raised it and found an untold fortune in gold coins on the ship. Well, I used that idea in one of my novels where the villain dupes this young boy into unloading a whole cargo of cocaine, saying it's a Spanish galleon treasure and you're in for it. And meanwhile, he tricks the kid and ultimately kills the kid because he doesn't want to witness. But that's where that idea came from, that little article. And sometimes I'm fascinated. Arthur Miller, who is my favorite dramatist, and my favorite play is All My Sons, an early Arthur Miller play. He was born and raised in the Chicago area. And, you know, Newsday has these little one-paragraph items about a particular item, just about so big. And Arthur Miller was reading something like that about a businessman in Chicago who had a government contract during World War II, and he was arrested for selling defective parts to the United States Army. That's all Arthur Miller read, that little 2 or 3 sentence thing. Out of that came All My Sons.
That play.
So that's, if you pay attention, and you got to pay attention to things all around you, you never know when you could use them and when they may inspire you.
Right. This is what I tell my listeners to my lectures or the kids that I talk to about writing books, is that you have to be an observer. You have to always look around you and take in the facts, because when they ask me where I get my ideas from, that's what I tell them. I'm a people watcher, for one thing, and I'm very interested in almost everything. I'm just interested. So you have to be interested in the world around you, and this way you accumulate all this stuff, and your brain is like a filing cabinet, and one day you're staring out the window thinking about nothing, and something collides, and there's the idea. So, I mean, that's kind of airy-fairy, but still in all, that's what happens. The ideas are up there. They just have to, something has to provoke you to remember them. The book that I have featured here today, The Secrets in the Fairy Chimneys, the idea for that book came from an article in an archaeological magazine. On my bucket list, I would like to go to an archaeological dig, sit hunched over in the hot sun with a toothbrush, you know, looking for minute things in a hole in the ground. I really want to do that. I do. And so I will read archaeology articles when I find them, and they were talking about this town that they found in Turkey. And it's the oldest town ever found. It's 9,000 years old. And I was fascinated by it. And so that provoked the idea for that story, that my heroine, who's like she's around 19 or 20 in this book, she goes as part of a college project to work this archaeological dig with her boyfriend, of course, who's a postdoc student at this point. And what they're investigating is, and that's the other thing that I'm interested in, is DNA. They're investigating the DNA that they find in the bones in this old town. They're trying to relate it to the DNA in the bones in Africa, where the human race originated, to see what the relationship is. Now, these books are for kids, but kids know about DNA. My adult friends don't know as much about DNA as a 4th grader does. So they can really relate to that topic. And so there was, even though it's a kid's book, I ended up doing a lot of research. The DNA is something that I taught, so that was there, but I had to research this town in Turkey. I went to Turkey because of this book. People think that Turkey inspired the book. No, the book inspired my trip to Turkey. And I pride myself on putting history and science in my book, so I have to make sure that it's accurate. So that's the next question. This is sort of a boring aspect of writing, but you have to document, and you have to make sure that you attribute to every person that you went to and every source you went to. Tell us about what that process is like.
Well, as you say, it's boring and it's laborious, but it has to be done.
It has to be done.
It has to be done if you want to gain any credibility. And not only do you have to credit the person or the documentation that you use, but it's even stronger if you could doubled or increased the number of citations that bear out your point.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, sometimes one source can contradict another, and so you're in a much stronger position if you can cite more than one source to prove your point. And then I think by the, in my case, I do a lot of documentation in order to indicate that I have done the research, and which I have. I couldn't just make these things up. I have, you know, it's part of what you uncover.
I also think the research part is fun. I like the research part. I like it better than writing the book, actually. I like making the outline and creating the characters and doing the research. And then writing the book, I should get a ghostwriter.
Yeah.
Put it all together, because that to me is the least fun. But the research and meeting different people. Who's the most interesting person you've ever met doing your research?
Well, I mentioned before Frank Turallo.
Okay.
Let me put it another way. The most interesting person I would have liked to have met, because I wrote about this man for my doctoral dissertation, Vito Marcantonio, who was a congressman from East Harlem, one of the most controversial congressmen in his time. I never met him. So in that case, I had to deal with the historical record, the books, the newspapers, and so on. But I did meet some interesting people in writing it. I was able to interview John McCormick, who was then Speaker of the House, who entered the House of Representatives at the same time Marcantonio did. He was kind enough to grant me an interview, and it was interesting, even though it was a short interview. I went down to Washington, D.C. It was during the time when Lyndon Johnson was the president and the Vietnam War was going on, and they had a hot issue before them regarding the war. But the Speaker of the House was kind enough to set aside 10 minutes for me, and all kinds of important people waiting around, but he took the time to speak with me and answer questions I had of him regarding Marcantonio. So that was fascinating, I think.
Oh, so he was a person who understood that he was working for the people, not the people working for him.
Yes, indeed, yes. Marcantonio was the most controversial man in his time, but he was probably the hardest working congressman of his time, too.
How about you, Jack? Did
Well,
you meet anybody who was
Sal
interesting?
LaGumina?
Yeah, me.
You. Yeah. Well, my first book was based on my fascination and and real heartfelt moment in World War II. The 5 Sullivan brothers who went down with their ship, the USS Juno. The only time this ever happened in American history. But there were 700 sailors aboard that ship. Only 10 survived, and I became friendly with one of the survivors. His name was Wyatt Butterfield. He was one of 10 to survive after spending 7 to 10 dreadful days in the ocean. And the 140 boys made it into the water, and 130 of those were killed by shark attacks over the next 7 to 10 days. But Wyatt survived, and
yeah, it's a riveting account that you make.
Right, and he became the heart and soul of my first novel, Bonds of War. But also James Jones, who was always a favorite of mine. He wrote From Here to Eternity, which was a National Book Award Pulitzer Prize. And then he wrote Some Came Running and The Thin Red Line. And he only wrote 3 or 4 books, and they all became movies. His daughter, I became friendly with his daughter, Kaylee Jones. So she gave me a lot of insight into what her father did, how he wrote, why he wrote, and so on. He died very young from acute alcoholism. He died, his lungs just filled up with fluid, and he died at the age of 57, something like that, when Kaylee was 16. So she has great memories of her father, sad but really poignant memories. And my relationship as a friend of hers was also very interesting and important to me as I wrote about World War II. And all my books really have, except for the Civil War book, obviously, but the other 3, Bonds of War and American Patrol, and I Still Love Joni James, all have significant, important attention to World War II and what this country went through in World War II.
And Heart of a Lion is the Civil War.
Story, yeah.
But it's a true story.
Oh yeah, it's called creative nonfiction.
Okay.
That's an interesting
Creative,
genre.
yeah,
And it's
it
not
is.
that old. It's only been around for maybe 20 years or so. But it's really a true story told in the form of a novel. So all of the history is true, but some of the names are made up, and it's told, it flows as though it were written as a novel. But that's for young adults.
That's actually my favorite genre. I love books about true historical facts where you create a cast of characters who take part in a different way in that, in that historical event. Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is one of my favorite authors of history, she got into trouble because she didn't document something. Right?
Yes.
And so people who come to me sometimes either through the show or through workshops, they have a stack of letters that were written by their great-grandmother or their grandmother to a soldier who was involved in World War II, and they want to make a book out of it. And they want to know how to do it. They have to understand that if they're going to make a story, the story has to have some basis in fact. And so then I get into the whole idea of the research. What research have you done? And Jack has a friend, Ray Russo,
Yes.
who has a pile of research he's done on. It's his brother.
Yes, his brother-in-law and his brother. Yeah, his brother was a World War II flyer, B-24 crew member, who kept a diary.
Okay.
And Ray has that diary of he flew something like 19 missions. So each mission was recorded by his brother, and it's fascinating. And I use that when I was teaching at Lindenhurst with my students. I used a section of the diary, and there's some unbelievable stuff where there was one story of the crew had fought for 8 hours, and fighting German fighter planes and bombing and fighting anti-aircraft, artillery and so on. Made it through, damaged. The plane was damaged, but it made it through and came back to the airfield. The pilot got off the ship, and in those English airfields, they had bikes to take him from the plane to and on his way from the plane to the barracks, on his bike, he was killed by a jeep. Killed by a jeep. I mean, come on. That is that is unbelievable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fate. So it's very important. I tell people it's very important to document. If you're going to put some facts in there, you have to document it. And people don't understand often how much work goes into a book. Another way that you can cite your sources, if your sources aren't, not like doctoral dissertations and whatnot, is in your acknowledgments. So-and-so helped me with this, so-and-so helped me with that. So there are ways that you can do it. But I wrote a blog once. I do a blog every once in a while on writer's block, because I get asked about writer's block. Research is a great way to get around writer's block, because if you're stuck in one part of the story, you don't know where to go, do a little research. Sometimes it makes you, gives you a clue as to where to go next. So that's another aspect of research. I can't stress how important research is when you write a book, because it makes the book more interesting. I even tell them, if you're writing one of those hot, sexy stories about some little town like Peyton Place, research the little town.
Right.
And it will give you, first of all, you'll be able to fill out some details, some nice details, because I think that's what people are looking for in books.
And I think once a person gets into research,
it's hard to get out.
Well, it's almost like a detective tracing, trying to find the clues that go from one point to another, and you accumulate quite a number of clues.
Could be your next book, right?
About the detective.
Yeah, but it could be
Well,
your next book.
A lot of my work does depend on what I did before. So when people ask me how long does it take, did it take you to write your most recent book? Well, I kind of give the answer that a New York Times sports reporter used to use. He had a column that was printed 3 times a week. It was 3 or 4 paragraphs. And when he was asked how long did it take him to write that, he would say, well, an hour or two. But behind that are 30 or 40 years of research and writing, etc. And I can appreciate that because essentially that's what I do. I don't come up from scratch. I can go back to prior work, prior research, notes, and so on.
Sure. Yeah, well, that's the basic research in my books are the science I taught all my life.
and the history that I taught all my life. All
so
my
you
adult
utilize
life.
it, sure, yeah.
So, you know, I think educators have a great platform.
Yes.
And also you have the training of doing the research. So you authors out there who are interested in writing a book, think in terms of how much research you want to do and what you want to do with it. For nonfiction, you better be careful. And for fiction, it's nice to have a body of facts, a body of reality, and then you can go from there, I think. So what's next for all of us?
Yes, I wanted to ask you. I was going to use that for part 3 of our interview, but since Linda brought it up, Sal, what's next?
Frequently when I write a book, I usually I'm able to get 2 or 3 scholarly articles out of that book. And I was just mentioning to Jack before that one of the people we did not get into today was Ernest Cuneo. There's enough there to write almost a book.
So we're going to be looking for Ernest Cuneo.
Well, we'll see.
All right.
With me, I've done most of the research for, to me, a fascinating character by the name Giovanni Martini, who was an Italian immigrant, came to this country in 1870s, was an expert horseman, joined the Army, was assigned to George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, and was there on June 25th of 1876 when Custer went into that little bighorn and thinking there were 300 Indians, there were 3,000.
Well, on that note.
But he survived. He survived.
On that note, just keep doing that research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, yeah.